Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
In 1969, Leonard Cohen released his own version of the Akedah in the song called The Story of Isaac. Part of its message was a protest against the older generation's decisions to send their children to war. Consider Cohen's rebuke. You who build these altars now to sacrifice these children, you must not do it anymore. A scheme is not a vision, and you never have been tempted by a demon or a god. You who stand above them now, your hatchets, blunt and bloody, you were not there before. When I lay upon a mountain and my father's hand was trembling with the beauty of the world, end quote. The Akedah's theme of trial, sacrifice, martyrdom, and death of the beloved son, which so critically informs and shapes subsequent Jewish as well as Christian theology, thus seeps its way into modern popular music. These songs cannot possibly be understood without first appreciating their rootedness, since this is Leonard Cohen, Eliezer Cohen, in the Jewish tradition and its foundational sources, and without a close look at their direct referent, one of the most powerful and shocking passages in the Hebrew Bible. Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, known as the Netziv, the dean, the Rosh Yeshiva of one of the most prominent rabbinic academies in Eastern Europe, the Lozhen, claimed that poetry captures the nature of the Torah much better than prose in its covert elusiveness that discloses meaning far beyond the simplicity and overt message of prose. The true sages, or the Talmidei Chachamim then, who unlock the secrets of Judaism's formative texts and teachings, are indeed the Torah's troubadours. Robert Zimmerman, AKA Bob Dylan, who we will return to in a moment, and Leonard Eliezer Cohen, Rock's Talmidei Chachamim, emerge out of this tradition in which song and Torah study, poetry and spiritual devotion are intertwined in a sacred embrace. Their turns to Judaism's sacred texts are not sacrilegious, but rather midrashic extensions of the profound role music plays within the tradition. In order to afford them their due, we need apply Netziv's methodology, searching for the meaning in the song's allusions. That this midrashic poeticization of the Akedah has footings in the Jewish tradition, I project back approximately a millennia to that figure who must be engaged on any issue critical to Jewish thought and theology ever since the Middle Ages. Moshe ben Maimon, Rambam, Ibn Maimun, the great eagle, Maimonides. His first important insight that opens up the Akedah to new interpretive vistas is that for him, all biblically recorded encounters with God or angels take place in the mind, that is, in the form of dreams, visions, or various contemplative states. Divine speech or commands, therefore, cannot possibly occur literally, but rather, when recorded in scripture, signify some kind of enlightenment that transpires in the human consciousness. The second key to the Akedah is that God's will for Maimonides is circumscribed by reason, and by definition, God is incapable of demanding anything that offends reason. The murder of an innocent certainly qualifies as morally and philosophically repugnant, and so further corroborates Maimonides' position that the Akedah, at least in my opinion, is a prophetic parable that crystallized in Abraham's mind to teach certain truths. In this case, how all-consuming the love of God must be, and how convinced a prophet must be as to the veracity of his prophetic message. This does not mean that the Akedah is any less real than if it were historically enacted. In fact, for Maimonides, the mind is the plane of a higher reality than the sensual world. Yet here also rests the problem. In a sense, Maimonides' Akedah solves the problem that has exercised so many of an immoral, indeed evil divine command. On the other hand, if what is durable, the only eternal remnant of human experience after death, is what goes on in the mind, according to Maimonides, then this attempted murder of his own son is in fact seared into Abraham's consciousness even deeper than it would have had it been physically played out in the material world. Even imagining his willingness to kill his son, to prove his commitment to a supreme value or truth, would have surely come at the cost of eviscerating the love he had for his child. This, of course, is borne out by the narrative itself, which describes Isaac as Abraham's only son whom he loved when commanded by God to slaughter him, et bincha et yichidcha asher ahavta, yet is described as simply his only son, no longer beloved, et bincha et yichidecha, once he passed the test of choosing God over his child. One of the most important features of the Akedah for Maimonides is what many might think a minor detail: the 3 days it took to get to the spot where the deed was to be done. This demonstrates for Maimonides that Abraham did not rashly rush to fulfill God's command out of passion, but rather only after a lengthy, careful, reasoned deliberation and exhaustive reflection. It seems to me, for Maimonides, Abraham's reflection could not have ended with the binding, but continued with the second part of the dream, when the angelic voice cries out for him to stop and substitute an animal. Taken as a whole, Isaac represents allegorically the lesson that the love of God must extend to sacrificing what one cherishes most. Yet, if that sacrifice involves another human being, one must in fact channel that commitment elsewhere. Yet the story doesn't end so neatly. However, I believe any understanding of this story that ties up all its loose ends and tries to neutralize its horror, drains it of its power, and dulls it of its provocation to reflect. Abraham's dream would have surely become a recurring nightmare at even entertaining the thought of slaughtering his child. The title track of that other great Jewish bard, Bob Dylan's 1965 album, Highway 61 Revisited, begins provocatively with a partial retelling of the opening lines in the Binding of Isaac narrative that originally appears in it. The first stanza reads as follows: "O God said to Abraham, kill me a son. Abe says, man, you must be putting me on. God says, no. Abe says, what? God says, you can do what you want, Abe, but the next time you see me coming, you better run. Well, Abe says, where do you want this killing done? God says, on Highway 61. Highway 61, winding its way some 1,400 miles across the USA, from the south in New Orleans to the north in Minnesota, symbolizes the spectrum of genres of quintessential American music. Dylan anchors that route in the image of the Akedah, which animates it with both the terror of encounters with God and the adventurous discovery of the lengthy road that traverses a wide swath of his own country. The road therefore discloses the endless musical possibilities it encompasses. If the killing is to be done on that highway, then perhaps Dylan appropriates Abraham's encounter and trial as a paradigmatic symbol of breaking new ground in poetry and musical creativity. The music that deserves traveling this road needs to adopt the boldness, the shockingness, the risk-taking, the offensiveness, and the suffering that must have informed Abraham's willingness to sacrifice what he most loved. If the poet-songwriter wants to play it safe and compose comfortable music, then she, in his words, better run. For music to approach the realm of the transcendent, it requires the censure and outrage that novelty and pioneering so often attract. The toll for this musical highway of meaningful inventiveness is sacrifice of the highest order. Cohen's treatment of Abraham, like Dylan's, is tinged with both reverence and revulsion. Abraham's relationship with his son starkly contrasts with those in the 60s over 30 in Cohen's own time, who failed to measure up to the tragic nobility of their biblical predecessor. While the biblical message of the Akedah may not sit right with Cohen, its poetry overwhelms him, compelling his own creatively subversive version in his The Story of Isaac. In a complex weave of horror, condemnation, and admiration, Cohen envisions a detached father rationalizing the murder he plans for his son. In his words, his voice was very cold. He said, "I've had a vision, and you know I'm strong and holy. I must do what I've been told," end quote. Is Abraham driven by self-centeredness? Is he delusional? Is he mindlessly obedient? Can he sincerely believe that killing in the name of God is what makes him, in Cohen's words, strong and holy? Is he truly suppressing his love for Isaac, or has it been inauthentic all along? After all, Isaac has already seen his father, quote, do what he has been told, end quote, when he sacrificed his other son, Ishmael, sending him out to the desert to die in accordance with Sarah's demands. Ishmael too draws Cohen's blessing in his poetry collection titled The Book of Mercy, quote, who covered his face with the wilderness and came to you in darkness, end quote. Playing on Ishmael's destiny to be what the Bible predicts he will be, a wild ass of a man, Cohen's Isaac already knows that his father is experienced in darkening a son's life. When Isaac gazes up from the altar, he is confused as to who or what stands over him. Quote, thought I saw an eagle, but it might have been a vulture. I never could decide, end quote. In this distinction between an eagle and a vulture raises the question, is Abraham a scavenger living off the dead, or is he the graceful model of the soaring freedoms and values that Americans declare they hold dear? Cohen's music itself annotates the trembling of the Akedah with beauty. Now I understand what initiated one of the great Jewish master-disciple relationships of the 20th century. After years and study, searching for a master to whom he could indenture himself, Rabbi David Cohen, known as the Nazir, visiting the same residence in Switzerland as Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Cook, who died in 1935 after being the first Ashkenazic pre-State of Israel chief rabbi, overheard Rav Kook praying in the morning. He was so enraptured by Rav Kook's musical rendition of the Akedah, quote, with an exalted song and melody, end quote, that he immediately knew his quest had come to an end and became Rav Kook's devoted acolyte for the remainder of his life. He captures Rav Kook's melodiously overwhelming effect by adopting the biblical description of King Saul's own transformation as a result of joining a prophetic musical troupe when, quote, he was turned into another man, end quote. If the retelling of a horrifying narrative such as the Akedah, imbued with what Kierkegaard called fear and trembling, could, by its chanting, be spiritually transformative and inspire the kind of cathartic enlightenment Saul experienced, then one can be certain that the singer, in this case Rav Kook, is the one who knows how to extract beauty from every other part of the body, of the Torah. And thus he became his disciple. Leonard the Cohen, in his rendition of the Akedah, follows the lead of these earlier Kohanim in communicating its inner beauty through song. And now I approach that dark period in the 20th century when Jewish existence imminently faced its literal demise. Civilization nearly died. when some would say all thought was ruptured and others would say God had died. And I recall a Hasidic master, the Piasetzner Rebbe, Rav Kalonymus Kalman Shapira's sermons, which were delivered in the Warsaw Ghetto, transcribed and buried, so that we might learn the Akedah anew in the shadow of a horror that surmounts any the original could have possibly imagined. One of the earliest sermons in the autumn of 1939, born of extreme personal crisis, is one that opens the door to abandoning old theologies that justified God's tolerance or worse, imposition of unwarranted suffering. The first sermon delivered after the death of the rabbi's only beloved son during the German bombing of Warsaw relates to the biblical portion that begins with the death of Sarah, Chaye Sarah. Its narrative sequence, which immediately follows the passage of the binding of Isaac, spurred rabbinic interpretation to link the two events, depicting the drama of the Akedah as causing Sarah's death by virtue of her hearing the news that her son was about to be slaughtered. Rav Shapira prefaces his own version of that causal chain by drawing on Hasidic theology, which conceives suffering as remedial, as purging one's sins and strengthening the covenant between the sinner and God. However, citing an ancestor, another seminal Hasidic master, he draws an analogy between suffering and salt, which, while effective as a preservative of meat, must be finely measured, or it could have the opposite corrosive effect. Likewise, suffering needs to be calibrated, balanced with compassion in order to prevent it from becoming purely destructive. Rav Shapira then builds on that idea and extends the traditional link between Sarah's death and what she had thought was the death of her son, or in other words, heart failure due to heartbreak, in a theologically startling, indeed radically new direction. Sarah, he says, in fact, intentionally surrendered her life in order to teach God the limits of corrective suffering, beyond which the torment simply becomes ruinous. Now hear the actual words of the Rebbe, and one can never sleep comfortably after listening. Sarah, our matriarch, these are his words, who took the Akedah so to heart to the point that her soul departed, acted for the benefit of Israel in order to demonstrate to God the impossibility of tolerating excessive suffering. And should the person survive that suffering by divine mercy, nevertheless, his strength, his mind, and his spirit would be irreparably broken and lost, end quote. That he considered Sarah to have literally committed suicide is clear from his exoneration of Sarah from what would normally be viewed as a transgressive act. For, quote, since she acted for the benefit of Israel, end quote. He says later in the sermon, she did not sin against those years she would have lived had she not intentionally cut her life short. Rav Shapira existentially and theologically challenges traditional reconciliation between God's goodness and innocent suffering. God has some theoretical notion of suffering as spiritually therapeutic, which leads to him administering it formulaically without regard to its dosage or the patient's tolerance. Rav Shapira challenges God to set aside the divine textbook, come down to earth in a sense, and monitor the side effects of his providential treatment plan and change course accordingly. The Rebbe provides no answer here, only a profound horror at having experienced the actual slaughter of his only son, while Abraham only bound his son on the altar. Maimonides allows Abraham's imagination to run wild, but even in his mind is spared the actual murder of his child. And so he teaches some lesson to humanity about dedication to God, about prophetic certitude. The Rebbe, however, is not spared the luxury of the anguish of a murdered child, and so reverses the narrative to teach God a lesson about the limits of human suffering. I now return to Leonard Cohen, who nearly half a century after the release of his story of Isaac, I spoke about earlier, traces of Abraham reappear in his curtain call just before his death in the Hineni that resonates with his words addressed to God in his song, You Want It Darker. Quote, you want it darker, we kill the flame, end quote. Abraham's unconditional love for God and preparedness to sacrifice anything for it, expressed by Hineni, here I am, now reflects a more complicated covenant. Darkness as well as light entangles the lover and the beloved. Moses also responded with a Hineni to God at the burning bush, which opened the door to his life of constant angst, frustration, anger, rejection, familial fragmentation, and ultimately failure to realize the very goal he was divinely commissioned to achieve, to lead his people into the promised land. If human beings and God are authentic partners, they can not only remain bonded by love's bliss, but must also share in its dark side, its brokenness, in sickness and in health. But a specter of the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe resonates in Cohen's last release, knowing full well his own death was imminent when he sings, quote, magnified, sanctified, be thy holy name, drawing on the Kaddish, vilified, crucified in the human frame, a million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker, Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready, my Lord. In a sense, this is precisely what the Warsaw Ghetto Rebbe intended with his sermon on the Akedah. God was always holy and sanctified, and always would be for the Rebbe. Yet Sarah's suicide compels God to observe the human frame, what Cohen calls the human frame, where the deaths of a million children can only lead to the vilification of God's presence. Though his own son was one of those candles whose flame was extinguished in the Shoah, indeed, there can be no doubt that Leonard Cohen's 1 million candles relates to the 1 million innocent children killed in the Shoah. Yet that flame continues to burn in the preserved words of the Rebbe, in the hope that the help that never came for him and his son would come for any future candles that might once again find themselves in danger of being extinguished.